Okay, hello everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Ellen Brenna. I'm the Natural Resources Coordinator for the City of Shoreview. And here with us tonight is Dr. Nick McCann from the University of Minnesota. You'll hear his presentation along with Jeff Miller here in a little bit. I just wanted to fill you in a bit. This is the final speaker of our 2021 speaker series. Every year, the Shoreview Environmental Quality Citizen Committee picks 4 environmental topics that they think will be of interest to the community. They reach out to experts in those fields and invite them to come and present. And tonight, Dr. McCann and Jeff Miller have been gracious enough to accept and to put together this wonderful presentation for us on some of our local urban wildlife. So if you have any questions, just wait till the end or type them into the chat box. Dr. McCann's here with us today, and he will be answering those once the talk is over. But for now, I'll just give you a little bit of an overview. University of Minnesota wildlife researchers Dr. Nick McCann and PhD student Jeff Miller are studying red fox, gray fox, and coyote in and near the Twin Cities. The project will map habitat use, assess diets, and measure disease prevalence for foxes and coyotes in the Twin Cities metro. Please enjoy this overview of their project and some preliminary results.
My name is Nick McCann. I'm the project manager for the Twin Cities Coyote and Fox project. I'll be presenting the first portion of this presentation that covers some of the background for the project, why we think it's interesting and useful for management, that sort of thing. And Jeff Miller, the PhD student on the project, will be presenting the second part of the presentation that focuses on some of the data we've collected and some initial inferences from that data. We're just kind of digging into the data now, so it's truly preliminary findings. So wildlife is important for urban landscapes for multiple reasons. There's several studies that show that wildlife provides important ecological services, including pest control. So we know, for example, in Chicago that coyotes are able to control goose populations in parks that are otherwise overrun in geese and their feces. We know that from multiple studies that wildlife improves resident well-being and their perception of the valuation of green spaces within urban areas. So residents feel better about their cities when there are wildlife species present, and they also value green spaces more when wildlife is present. So although wildlife provides lots of benefits, it can present challenges to people that live in urban areas. Human-wildlife conflicts can range from simply seeing a species in your neighborhood that might be perceived as a conflict to some people, all the way up to more extreme instances of wildlife either attacking pets or attacking people in some instances. There's a wide range of what we mean when we're talking about conflict, but certainly any of these can be perceived as negative, and therefore people might perceive these species being present in their city as negative when conflicts arise. Research is important because we can actually learn about how animals use cities and how they may or may not come into conflict with people. And if we can learn about ways that people and wildlife can coexist within these urban areas. So this is becoming increasingly important as wildlife has become either more prevalent in some cities or at least has become more noticeable in some cities. Research on urban wildlife tends to be relatively rare. This is an issue because we don't understand urban wildlife very well when we skip through research that's been conducted in more rural settings. So country animals don't operate the same way as do city animals in many instances. An example of this would be coyote activity patterns. We know from studies in more natural settings that coyotes tend to be animals that split their activity period evenly between night and day. As you move more into urban areas, coyotes become almost strictly nocturnal. They're very aware that they might not be wanted by some city residents, and or they are trying to avoid strikes by vehicles, and therefore they tend to focus their activity periods at night to avoid both of those things. So our project, the Twin Cities Coyote and Fox project, is a first for the state of Minnesota. There's been data collected each of these species through track surveys and other monitoring projects through MENAR, and there's been some research, I think the late 70s, that was not published in the scientific journal at least. But beyond that, there's been no research for coyotes, red foxes, or gray foxes within the state of Minnesota, which is pretty surprising. And therefore, there's been no research from the Twin Cities area as well. So we're kind of treading new ground for the three species within the city, and hoping to learn about where they go and what they do within the urban context, but also out kind of into the rural end of the gradient as you range out to the suburbs. So the goals for our project are pretty wide ranging. We're interested in getting a rough estimate of how many coyotes and foxes there are within the Twin Cities metro area. We're interested in predicting where they are most likely to be distributed, what they're eating, and what diseases they're carrying. We're also interested in identifying potential hotspots for risk of disease transmission between pets and coyotes, but also conflict with people. So are there trails or parks that are more likely to have coyotes in them, for example, during times of year when people are also using those same spaces? More broadly, we're interested in demystifying coyotes and foxes for urban residents. So this isn't something that we can quantify necessarily, but I think by providing information to the public about their cohabitants of the cities, so coyotes and foxes, we can help them understand why these animals might be using the cities, how they are using the cities, what risks they may or may not pose to them, and let them make up their own mind based on good information that's collected in a systematic way, rather than perhaps using information from less reliable sources. So the main approach for our project is to conduct kind of good old-fashioned blue-collar wildlife research. So we capture, color, and collect biological samples from coyotes and foxes. We do so within the 7-county Twin Cities metro area. So the densely populated urban core, the suburbs that ring it, and then also the exurban areas that are on the outskirts of the cities that are tending to be more rural and natural in character. So our data come from the collars that we put on these animals. So we'll get over 1,000 locations per animal per year, and we can kind of learn about where they go and when they go there, and use that to model some of the potential for conflict with people, for example, but also to learn about how they use green spaces and some other unexpected areas of the cities as well. Those same collars also provide information about the activity periods for these animals. We can kind of learn about when they're active versus when they're inactive throughout the year and throughout the day, for example. And it'll also enable us to estimate how long they live. So some animals have died already by car strike or disease, and we can kind of learn about how often that happens and how long animals tend to live within the area. The biological samples that we collect are blood, hair, and fecal matter. And from those samples, we can learn about the diseases they carry and also what they're eating. So we can kind of get an estimate of those things for urban, suburban, and more rural coyote foxes. One of the results from this research will be maps that show the distribution of each of the three species within the Mississippi area, and also the risk of conflict with them. So these will be kind of probabilistic, so they'll be showing potentials where we think these animals are more likely to be based on habitat requirements, and also where they are during, where our study animals tend to be during netting periods, and how that might align with where people go during those same periods, for example. We're also interested in mapping diseases on the landscape. So at minimum, we're going to develop baseline information about what diseases are present in the cities. Our hope is that we can also tie this to landscape variables that we can kind of map out, create a color-coded map that shows where diseases like parvo and distemper are more likely in the landscape or less likely. Another approach of ours is outreach efforts. So we developed a Facebook site, a University of Minnesota website, and also an iNaturalist website. Each has different information about the project and coyote boxes generally. The iNaturalist site also has a spot where you can download information about sightings or any of the species. We also develop connections with different groups in the area. So nonprofits like Friends of the Mississippi River have worked with us. Cities in the area, we often contact and let them know we're working there. And of course, landowners have been a super useful contact, and we're able to provide them with information, and often they're able to provide us with a great deal of information about what they know of their local coyote boxes. We deliver presentations to cities and colleges, and also provide mentorship to undergraduates at the University of Minnesota. So just briefly, I thought I would talk a few minutes about the risk that is posed to people and pets by coyotes with this area. The reason I'm breaking this out is it's usually a topic of conversation at presentation video. I thought it would be good to have a few slides on some of the information that we have. So we know from previous research that some cats and small dogs are killed by coyotes. These tend to be free-ranging cats and unattended small dogs that get taken. And we know that most dog attacks, small dog attacks by coyotes, occur during the pup rearing season when coyotes are becoming territorial. So that May through July area, when they have pups in the den, they perceive themselves as protecting those pups and attack small dogs that are unattended and probably do not have the ability to go inside or leave the area as the coyote is approaching. We do know that coyotes sometimes attack people, but these instances are very rare and usually result in the equivalent of a dog bite. So the injuries are probably traumatic for the person who's sustained them, but generally not very serious from a medical perspective. I think it's important to note here that coyotes generally do not show any aggression towards people and usually want to be unseen. So they will shift their kind of where they go and what time they're active to avoid people. Almost all attacks against people and pets can be prevented using pretty simple measures. So we would suggest that you keep an eye on your pets when they're outside, and also your small children when they're outside. That seems pretty reasonable for a number of things that you might be concerned about, but also for preventing attacks by coyotes. Maybe less obvious is keeping your pet food inside. So if you are feeding your pet outside, some of that food will invariably be missed by your pet and may attract different wildlife, including coyotes. It may also attract small animals like mice and squirrels and things of that nature. And coyotes are looking for those animals to eat them. So you can be indirectly or directly attracting coyotes by feeding your pet outside. So in general, maintaining garbage also pet food when it's outside, receptacle that's not going to be accessible to animals. It's also considered a good preventative measure. Lastly, it's been suggested that hazing coyotes is a measure that can be taken to kind of show them that humans are boss in the area and that they're not welcome. So if you have a coyote that is becoming more visible in your neighborhood and you don't want it to be there, if you're comfortable doing so, hazing is one way to sort of tell it to get lost, basically. So you can raise your arms, use a loud voice to announce yourself, and approach the animal if it doesn't leave the area when it's observed. In a study in Denver, over 70% of animals, 70% of coyotes left the area when they were approached in this manner. Not everybody's comfortable doing this, and that makes some sense. But I think that in general, this is something that you can think about doing if you're interested in kind of pushing these animals out of your yard or out of your neighborhood. I probably put one kind of last slide here to put things into perspective. I'm going to present some data here from Bloomington. Bloomington made the news a number of years ago for having a spike in pets that were killed by coyotes. It was 2015. So they had a number of instances where it was probably one coyote or attack of coyotes that was guilty of killing some unattended small dogs in people's backyards. This made the media and really kind of shifted perceptions against coyotes within Bloomington. There might be similar data for other cities, but Bloomington's a city that we've gotten a lot of help from. We have their data that's publicly available, so I'm going to use this as an example. So in Bloomington, between 2015 and 2019, a median of 2 dogs were killed by coyotes each year. If it was my dog, I would be devastated by that, and my perception of coyotes would change for the negative for sure. But to put this into perspective, as a scientist might, we can compare it to other things that happened in Bloomington during that period that would be perceived as negative. And these are the numbers for that same period. So annually, there were 11 arsons, 53 robberies, and 181 burglaries in Bloomington, according to their city website. So I think of Bloomington as a very nice city. When I visited, I enjoyed it. I don't think it's a particularly dangerous city, but relative to coyote attacks on pets, you're around 5 times more likely to be the victim of an arson, 25 times more likely to be the victim of a robbery, and about 9 times more likely to be the victim of a burglary in Bloomington, which is probably a relatively safe city. So I think it's important to keep some of the concerns that we have about coyotes returning to urban areas or entering urban areas, keeping those numbers into some sort of a perspective is important. And with that, I will turn things over to Jeff Miller, the project's PhD student. He'll present some of the data we've collected so far and maybe some preliminary inferences about those data. So thank you very much for your time and your interest in our project, your attention. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Nick mentioned, I'm Jeff Miller, the PhD student working on the Twin Cities Coyote and Fox project. So Nick covered a lot of the background about coyotes and foxes in urban areas, and a little bit of the background about wildlife in urban areas in general. So my portion of this presentation will focus more on the preliminary results that we have from the project this far, and I'll give a brief overview of how we actually collect the samples that we're using to study these animals. So in our project, we're focusing on 3 wild canines that live in the Suffolk County metro area. And this isn't counting the wolf that showed up on the trail camera in northern Anoka County a while back. So these Coon Rapids. In the middle, that's a coyote that a resident sent us a picture of in St. Paul. And on the right is a red fox from Golden Valley. Both of the foxes in these photos are under anesthesia while we were working on them to collect data. And you'll notice that the thing in common between all three of these animals is that they've been fitted with a GPS tracking collar. And that's the main data set that we work with and look at closely to track their movement and activity patterns, and really get some insight into how these animals are using urban areas. So when we capture a study animal, there are a number of steps that we go through every time, just so that we can make sure that we're collecting the exact same data from each animal. So I'll just briefly go through this process, just so you get an idea of what data collection looks like. So first, once we have a live trapped animal, the first thing that we have to do is tranquilize it and transport it to the area where we'll be working with it. So on the right-hand side here, you can see me carrying a tranquilized gray fox to our processing area, so that we have all of our equipment ready to go and we can quickly work with the animal and release it back to where it came from. Then, since the GPS collars are our priority source of data, we fit that collar first, which you can see me doing here on the left-hand side with a red fox. The next sample that we collect are those that are needed for testing the animal for diseases. So this includes collecting a small sample of blood from the animal, and then also taking a sample of fecal matter so that we can test for both viral parasites or viral diseases and parasites that the animal might be carrying. Finally, our last major sample that we collect from an animal is a bit of hair from the back of the neck. And we do this so that we can determine what the fox or coyote has been eating using stable isotope ratios. Essentially, stable isotope analysis is just another fancy way of saying that we can use chemistry from the animal's hair to determine what the animal has been eating by matching carbon and nitrogen amounts to what's found in the environment in different food sources. So after we put a collar on the animal and collect the other information that I mentioned, we also look at the teeth of the animal, and we do this to estimate how old it is. So, for example, we might estimate that the female coyote on the left here is likely 2 or 3 years old based on how big her teeth are and how worn and stained they are. And then we also look over the fur of the animal to see if it has any parasites like ticks or mange. So as soon as we've taken these samples, which usually takes between 20 and 30 minutes, we then give the animal a drug that reverses the anesthesia, and then we release it back to where it came from. So here is a fun compilation of a few of our study animals running off. And in order, it's a red fox from Golden Valley, a gray fox from Anoka, and a coyote from As Nick mentioned before, our study area is the Twin Cities metro area. And you can see here below, there are various levels of urbanization across this area. So in this map, the darkest areas represent the highest levels of urbanization. And towards the center of that area, you can see that's kind of the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And of course, that's the most urbanized area. But there are also less urbanized areas, as you can see from the surrounding wider areas. Those would be more what we're considering rural areas. So now I'll just just quickly summarize how many study animals we have so far on the project. So we've collected data from 15 coyotes, including 7 females and 8 males. So this is a coyote living in St. Paul, playing with its cache of old baseballs and tennis balls. And this is a pack member of one of the female coyotes that we are studying in the project. We've also worked with 16 red foxes, and this includes 6 females and 10 males. This is a pair of red foxes, also from the Twin Cities metro area. This is a pair in Crystal on the west side of metro, northwest of Minneapolis. And then we've only captured 1 gray fox on the project so far, a female. This species seems to be far less common in the metro area, and it's also harder for us to work with because of its highly nocturnal activity, and that just makes them harder to locate than the other 2 species. Here you can see how those animals are spread out across the area and even outside of the metro counties due to some of the animals moving out of the area. So Minneapolis is kind of at the center of the cluster on the left, and each of these points represents 1 location that we've collected from a study animal. So you can see we have thousands of locations so far collected throughout the metropolitan area. And you can see kind of the path that one of our study animals, the coyote, took out of the cities to the west. He ended up in Wisconsin. But one really useful way that we as scientists like to think about how animals use space is by trying to determine what their home ranges are. So these blue areas, you can essentially think of as areas where coyotes spend 95% of their time, or that's 95% of the locations that we collected from these animals fall within these areas. So each of these areas, and you can see kind of smaller pockets of areas next to larger home ranges, those represent areas where the 14 coyotes spent most of their time. And we can do a similar thing for the red foxes that we've studied on the project. So these are the home ranges for 14 of the red foxes that we've studied on the project. That small area near Anoka is where our female gray fox's home range is. And then I think it's interesting to see how the home ranges of these 3 different species of animals overlap. So from the overlap between these species, we can kind of gain some insight into how these animals interact with each other and how they might compete for resources like food or denning areas where they can have litters of kids and pups. And if you zoom in even closer, in this case to the Anoka area, you can see how these animals really divide up the space. So in this photo, a coyote is represented by the light blue color. A gray fox is the dark gray points on the top left. And the red and orange points are actually 2 different red foxes. So we can see how there's some slight overlap between these animals, but overall they tend to avoid each other and really maintain distinct territories where they can easily access reliable food resources and denning sites without having to worry about being pestered by their neighboring coyote or foxes. Something else that we're really interested in on this project is what are the causes of death for coyotes and foxes in these urban areas. And so far we have some pretty interesting preliminary results. So as you might expect, 25% of red foxes were killed by cars, similarly 33% of coyotes. So that's kind of expected in high traffic areas like urban areas. What we weren't really expecting was 37% foxes were assumed to be killed by coyotes. So evidence showed that they were attacked by a larger canine, and we're assuming that larger canine was indeed a coyote. Another interesting fact is that mage was a contributing factor to the death of 25% of the red foxes that died. And we also had one coyote get killed by a hunter, and that was the one that actually moved from the cities to Wisconsin. But you might find it interesting to see what kinds of specific locations some of our study animals are using, especially the more urban ones. So these are locations from a male red fox near downtown Minneapolis. So you can see this is our direction we're facing here is kind of northeast. So Minneapolis is kind of in the background with Lake of the Isles in the foreground. And this fox really uses the highly urbanized area close to Hennepin Avenue near downtown Minneapolis and uses some of the urban parkway along Lake of the Isles and the park right downtown near Loring Pond. So this is a highly urban animal. Then I talked a little bit about how these animals are moving. So these points here represent a red fox that was captured in Roseville and just with the collar. And that fox ended up moving into downtown, as you can see here. And eventually this fox ended up in Crystal. So about maybe 10 miles, maybe a little more northwest of the cities, or northwest of Minneapolis. That's kind of some interesting behavior to see, and we didn't really expect to see foxes this far. I already talked about this individual a little bit. So this is the coyote that ended up moving out of the Twin Cities. So it was on the St. Paul campus of the University of Minnesota. And it ended up moving over, I believe it was over 70 miles, close to somewhere between 70 and 100 miles into Wisconsin, where it was eventually shot by a hunter. And then beyond just the tracking data that we get from animals, we also look at we try to monitor den locations and get counts of how many pups and kits these animals are having. So we get hours worth of footage of kits running around with their mother like this. This also allows us to get some really interesting insight into how coyotes and foxes are using dens. So this is a really interesting example. I don't know if you guys can make out what that female coyote is holding in her mouth there, but that's actually one of her pups. And by monitoring the den with a trail camera, we were able to determine the date when this coyote moved her pups to a separate den location. She actually moved them over a mile through a really urbanized area, and she moved 3 of these pups in the course of an hour. And you can hear that she ended up moving them to a stormwater outlet. And that was a really interesting behavior to see, and especially to see how quickly she moved them between sites. So the timeline for our project is as follows. So we started in the fall of 2019, and we've completed 2 collaring study sessions. So those go from September to February, and that's those 2 seasons from 2019 to 2020 and 2020 to 2021 is where we've captured studied animals so far. Last summer, we also did have that sampling in the spring and summer, which we will continue into this summer, 2021. And then our final reporting for this project will be in 2022. And we are applying for funding through the LCCMR to extend this project into the future. So that was just a brief overview of some of the results we have so far. Of course, we have to dig into the data a little bit more, and many of our animals are still out there collecting data for us with their collars. So more results are yet to come, and we can expect to get some of those results out in 2022. So at this time, that would conclude our presentation. So I'd like to acknowledge some of the contributors and funding sources for the project. So the co-PIs on this project are James Forrester and Megan Kraft, along with Nick Kent. Graduate students include me and Katie Worsley-Trump. And we had a lot of help from interns and other helpers from the veterinary medicine department. So that includes Neefart, Manny Grumpley, Jessica Photo, and Logan Dye. And then we also had countless contributors. I don't want to keep us here all day and name everybody specifically, but this includes numerous landowners, folks from the Three Rivers Park District, Friends of the Mississippi River, Bloomington Animal Control, USDA Wildlife Services, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, the Minnesota Trappers Association, David Drake from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, the Minnesota DNR, Minnesota Commercial Railways, the University of Minnesota Facilities Management team, the National Park Service, Anoka Ramsey Community College, and also Excel Energy. And then our funding was provided by the ENRTF as recommended by the LCCMR. So with that would wrap up our presentation. Thank you for your presence here and for listening to the presentation. And Nick and I will take any questions you have. Thank you.
Okay. So that was our wonderful presentation. Let me go here and quick make sure that Dr. McCann can answer any questions that anybody has. If anyone has any questions, please type them into either the chat box or the question and answer box, and we'll get going on Q&A. There it is. Great. Hi, Dr. McCann. Thank you very much for joining us. I don't have any questions yet, except for I've got one myself. I was just kind of curious what your sample size, what you were hoping to get. Is this around as many animals as you're hoping to study, or are you hoping to get as many as possible? What are your thoughts there?
So first of all, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Awesome. Yeah, so our goal was to capture 45 study items, 15 of the 3 species. We had a very hard time finding gray foxes in the Twin Cities metro area, but we've had far more success finding coyotes and red foxes, obviously. So a little disappointed with our gray fox numbers, but pretty happy with our coyote and fox numbers, red fox.
Great. Yeah, you've got some good numbers. I know I'm in that pocket of Golden Valley that they showed. So.
My name is Nick McKeon. I'm the project.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, it's pretty challenging to capture them in the urban setting, especially. So it's difficult to find locations to work where you're not going to be interacting with people and pets. So that's been a particular challenge that I think we understood going in, but didn't understand maybe as well as we do now.
Great. Yeah, I bet. I bet. We have a question in from John. Sounds like from North Oaks. So in North Oaks, they see many more coyotes in the last several years. Foxes have disappeared. Do you know if coyote numbers are increasing overall?
So that's a good question. I don't think I have like solid information as to whether there are more coyotes in North Oaks than there were previously. I would trust observations like his and others from the area to kind of suggest that there probably are more than there used to be. And we've certainly seen coyotes push red foxes out of areas that they had been in previously. So it does make some sense that it's definitely possible that coyotes have come in and pushed out red foxes. We do know that several of our red foxes that we've had collared were killed by coyotes. So they are a larger species and can kind of dominate the relationship. And yeah, sort of push red foxes out of some areas. So it's a possibility. I will say that we have some red foxes that have their entire territories within coyote territories. So that can happen as well. So it's not always that they'll be pushed out. It certainly does happen.
Great. Thank you. Oh, I see Ralph has a question here. So Ralph says, we see and hear coyotes in the Rice Creek corridor in northern Shoreview very often. Have any attempts to find subjects in northern Ramsey County been made?
So we didn't have a very good picture of our study area in our presentation. We'll have to improve upon that. I would say that we haven't really looked quite up that way. We're limited to myself and Jeff doing most of the field work with some help from volunteers and other temporary staff. So we didn't get up to all the areas that we'd like to. So no, we didn't kind of work up the northern Shoreview area. So.
Okay. And I think that kind of answers our next question from Hong, who is an EQC member. Do you have rough numbers of coyotes within Shoreview?
Yeah, sorry, I don't. I would say this though, wherever we look, we seem to be able to find coyotes around the Twin Cities area. I'm not saying that they occur everywhere, but it seems to be most places that we look, we find them or a sign of them. And so they probably have some. It's in terms of putting a number on how many there are. I would say that our perceptions of how many there are is probably greater than the actual number. So most of them are ranging around, I think, 20 square miles or so, sometimes 30 square miles. So that's their territory size. So when we see an animal in one end of our city, and then or see a coyote, like say in the north end of Minneapolis, and then also a coyote on the south end of Minneapolis, it could very well be the same coyote. So in Shoreview and other areas, if you see one in different spots, it probably is very likely could be the same individual or an individual from the same pack. And most of our packs, what we're calling a pack, tends to be probably 2 or 3 individuals at this point, as far as we can tell. So they'll have litters in the spring, but there does not appear to be great recruitment in coyotes or red foxes, as far as we can tell. We're not capturing a lot of juveniles. So most of our animals are adults. They have litters, but those litters don't tend to be very productive. At least they're not. It does not appear that they're making it through the first winter. We're running our trap lines. So all in all, there's many out there, but in terms of how many, I bet it's less than we think there probably are.
Okay, interesting. Question from Wendy. What do coyotes eat aside from fox? Rabbits, birdseed?
So they primarily eat small mammals and rabbits and other things like that. They're pretty varied in their diets, so they can eat other things as well, but they are carnivore and do concentrate on capturing small mammals, things up to the size of a rabbit, but also some birds and some fruit and things like that exist in their diet as well. A lot of the scats that we've seen, interestingly, have had apples in them, which we think is kind of funny and maybe a little bit unexpected. So a pretty varied diet for sure.
Great. This one's from Maria. It's interesting that fox and coyotes stayed away from each other within the cities along the river. Do you have any theories as to why the foxes stayed nearest to the river while the coyotes were located further out?
I think they both use the rivers. We think they use the river corridor as a means to, I guess, travel through the cities without having to go through travel on roads or other access ways that we would use. Those are really nice green spaces that they can use and kind of travel without being observed by people or interacting with them. So we think they both use them. I think the distribution map that we showed is biased a little bit by just where we caught animals. I don't think that's a true distribution map of all animals or where we're going to expect all animals to be. I think there are coyotes using probably most of the Twin Cities metro area at one time or another. Foxes tend to be a little bit more residential in how they use the landscape. So our theory behind that is basically coyotes, again, dominate the relationship because they're much larger, around probably between 25 and 35 pounds. And foxes maybe around 12 or 14 pounds, thereabouts. So our kind of working theory, hypothesis, I guess, is that coyotes are dominating some of the larger green spaces, and red foxes kind of get pushed into the more residential areas where they can make a living without being bothered by coyotes as often, because coyotes tend to avoid people. So they're using the green spaces, they'll venture out into the more residential areas. That's not where they spend most of their time, it does not appear. So foxes, to kind of counter that, will spend more of their time in the residential areas where they have less opportunity to interact with coyotes, which could be really negative for them if that does happen.
I have another question myself. We've got quite a few foxes around here in my neighborhood, and I found that they like to sit on people's front steps and just right up close and have really no qualms about having people and pets around. Is that what, I mean, do you know if more rural foxes behave the same way? Is that an instance of where they live, or any thoughts on that?
That's a good question. I know it's not a new phenomenon or one that's like unique to the Twin Cities area in terms of like urban foxes being more visible and more amenable to kind of being observed by people or even interacting with them. I don't know if the same is true in the countryside. I have spoken with residents kind of more out into the outer exurban areas of the 7-county Twin Cities metro. And those people have also seen foxes in their backyard. I don't know if they're sitting on their front porch as much, but I don't have good data on that, but I think they tend to be a little bit more visible and okay with being around people relative to coyotes.
Interesting. Another question from Ralph. Do they affect ground nesting birds and fawns?
So I guess I would say yes for coyotes for sure. It's definitely possible. I think they're opportunistic feeders. So if they find nests, they will eat them. If there are fawns that they come across as well, that's a possibility. Foxes, I would say yes for birds, but not for fawns. I would have a hard time believing a 12 or 14 pound fox does much with a fawn after it's a day or two old, probably. So, but almost certainly for ground nesting birds. I think their primary diets tend to be more mammalian, so they're eating more small mammals. But if an opportunity arises for a bird, I think they'll take that.
And in terms of mortality, it seems like you've seen quite a bit on both sides, or for both species, or all three species, I should say. It was about what you expected in terms of your hypothesis, or were you expecting less mortality or maybe more?
That's a good question. I would say I expected less for foxes. I'm not sure why that was. I'm a little surprised by how many of our foxes have died so far. So I think it's over half of the ones that we've collared have died either by being killed by a larger canid, probably a coyote, or by being struck by cars, and a couple of diseased animals as well. So I'm a little surprised by that, to be honest.
Yeah, I was as well, hearing your data. So good to know. Keep an eye out on the roads.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions? If so, type them into the box now, either the chat or Q&A. Otherwise, I think we can let Dr. McCann get on with his evening, but thank you very much. And please send our thanks to Jeff as well. Really great presentation. And we got, about 20 people here. So that's good for us. A beautiful day outside today. So
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending. I'm sorry about the audio. I don't know if that was on our end or your end, but it was a little echoey on my computer. So hopefully we'll fix that for next time, and you'll have us back anyway, and we can deliver some more of the results.